Welcome back. Some of President Trump's biggest victories in his first 100 days in office include his ability to roll back business, crushing regulations. The regulatory environment has been a focus for him. Also sustaining sanctions against rogue nations like Iran and North Korea. In a First on Fox Business interview, Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin pinpointed what the administration considers the most crucial parts of the Washington bureaucracy to rein in.
The president signed 4 different executive orders or memorandums that we're working on. So first of all, on taxes, we're looking at every major tax regulations since 2016 and making sure that it's impactful and it's there for the right reasons and not the wrong reasons. We need to simplify the tax code. And then on the financial side, as you know, we've been working on, since the early days, a report. We'll be coming out with our first report in the beginning of June, and it'll be a combination of recommendations. It's looking at Dodd-Frank, but it's looking much broader than Dodd-Frank. And there's certain things that we'll be able to change and make recommendations for regulators to put in. There's certain things that we'll make recommendations for the president with executive orders, and there's certain things we'll make recommendations for legislation with Congress. But we're hard at work on that, and we've met literally with hundreds and hundreds of business leaders, from small community banks to large financial institutions. We're taking in a lot of input as we come up with these recommendations.
Because some people feel that the regulatory environment was more burdensome, even so, than the tax rates.
Not a question about that. When I was on the campaign trail with the president and we met with business leaders, the #1 thing they complained about holding back growth was regulation, even more so than taxes.
Yeah, it's they don't know what's around the corner because of the regulatory environment, and so they'll sit on cash. That's what's been happening these last 8 years. Companies sitting on cash, unwilling to put new money to work.
Absolutely, and that's what's hurt productivity. And we want to make sure that banks are lending to small and medium-sized businesses that are the engine of economic growth in this country.
Is that what happened in the first quarter with this weak GDP? How would you characterize things right now?
Well, part of it was a seasonally adjusted number that's lower, but I think part of it is we've seen for the last 8 years very, very low economic growth. And we expect that we can rebound by putting in our new economic policies and create growth and jobs for the American public.
So over the near term, it's okay if a tax cut adds to the deficit. Over the near term, you're not worried if, in fact, we see a little pressure on the debt of this country, because longer term, you believe that the growth generated from these lower taxes will actually be quite substantial.
Right. Maria, let me make 2 comments on that. First of all, as you know, the debt went from $10 to $20 trillion under the last administration, and President Trump is very concerned about that. But having said that, we fundamentally believe in dynamic scoring and dynamic effects, so that when we put in tax cuts, that will stimulate the economy. And as you said, there may be some deficits in the short term that will be paid for with economic growth.
I'm not concerned about the timeline. I know everyone's focused on, when this gets done. But in terms of getting it done this year, I think if we were not to see tax reform, sort of at least the beginnings of it this year, markets would react negatively. People would be disappointed. Do you have confidence in that in 2017?
Well, I'm not going to comment on the markets. As you know, kind of markets go up and markets go down. I think the fact the market's up is a sign of the confidence in the Trump administration and the economic policies. But my focus and my job is to do everything I can to get this done this year. And we're going to look at making sure, see if we can. One of the things we're going to try to do is make it retroactive. And we'll have to work on that. But we want to create economic growth as soon as we can.
That would be very powerful, obviously, retroactive. Let me ask you this while we're on the subject of markets for a moment, because you've got to walk this balance. You are coming out with policies that will stimulate growth. When you have a growing economy, people buy the stock market there and they buy the dollar, and the dollar will move up. And so while you're coming out with stimulative policies, the dollar moving higher is not helpful, making our products more expensive overseas. How do you deal with that?
Well, again, Maria, the dollar seems to be the favorite thing for people to ask me about, and I've been consistent in my response, which is, in the short term, the dollar will move in different directions. Okay, obviously, an increase in the dollar has certain short-term impacts, but the long-term growth of the dollar is a reflection of people's belief in the U.S. economy, the U.S. being the reserve currency of the world, and being the best place to invest. The U.S. markets have been, for very, very long periods of time, a very safe and healthy place for people to invest, and we continue to see that.
Oh, even the president said it's too strong. Let me move on to sanctions, Secretary Mnuchin, because the power of the Treasury is pretty incredible. It should actually be part of the Defense Department in some ways. The president has changed the framework of the world through economic sanctions, and you've been spending a lot of time on this. Talk to us about what you're doing in terms of sanctions regarding Syria and elsewhere in the world.
Maria, you know, it's interesting because there's lots to do with the Treasury, but there's three fundamental parts. One is domestic finance, the second is international finance. That's what most people think of as the U.S. Treasury, but there's a third part of what we do that we call terror financing and intelligence, and I probably have spent 50% of my time on that. The sanctions programs are very important. They're a very important tool in our national security. That's why I work very closely with the rest of the National Security Council. And as you know, we just came out with 250 new sanctions on Syrian entities. We've come out with sanctions on North Korea. We've been administering the Iran sanctions and the Russia sanctions. These are very important programs that we work very hard at Treasury and work very closely with the intelligence community.
Because when you want to impact something, you cut off the funding.
Absolutely, and it works.
And is that what the sanctions are about? Explain the sanctions. What specifically are we doing?
The sanctions are about making sure that where people are supporting terrorist activities or weapons of mass destruction, that we are cutting them off from the U.S. financial system, and we are encouraging our partners around the world to do the same thing. Primary sanctions are where they're cut off from the U.S. system, and where, on occasion, we put out secondary sanctions, which are very, very powerful. And what secondary sanctions say is that institutions must honor them or they're cut off from the U.S. financial system, which you know is a major part of the world economy. So these are very, very important tools we have at Treasury, and we will use them to the maximum amount we can under the law to make sure that entities do not support terrorism.
And that would be as it relates to Syria. Is there anything that you can tell us about North Korea, given the fact that this morning we've got some pretty scary comments coming out, basically saying we're ready if North Korea has any more provocations and attempts of real attack?
Well, I'm not going to make any specific comments about that side, but what I would say is we have put sanctions on North Korea. We will continue to look at this. I'm not going to comment about what we will do in the future, but the sanctions programs are very important to our national security.
And you think they are effective?
Absolutely.
Because we had a guest on a couple of weeks ago and said, look, sanctions against Russia, for example, do not work.
Again, I'm not going to comment on the specific sanctions, but I can tell you the sanctions programs do work, and they are powerful tools, and we will continue to use them.
Okay. As we wrap up, Secretary, let me just go back to the tax plan for a moment. And, of course, that was a white paper that you came out with last week, the policies and the principles of what you'd like to see in a tax reform package. Are you more interested in tax reform, or you want to get these just tax cuts done? Again,
this is tax reform. This will be the largest tax cuts in the history of the country and the biggest tax reform that's ever been done. And the president's been thinking about this for a long time. He's been working on this since the campaign, and he is determined that we will move forward on these programs, which will create economic growth for this country.
How come tax reform has been so difficult to get done?
We're going to get it done.
Secretary, great to have you on the program.
Thank you, Maria. Pleasure to be here.